The thunderous crunch of metal against metal echoed across the quiet suburban cul-de-sac as Patricia Winters stood frozen, her mouth forming a perfect O shock. Her prized Harley-Davidson, a gleaming showcase of chrome and custom paint that she parked strategically across the dirt access road, now lay crushed beneath the massive tires of Hank Miller's Ford F-350. "You can't just," Patricia sputtered, her manicured finger trembling as she pointed at her mangled motorcycle. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Hank killed the engine and stepped out of his truck, work boots landing heavily in the dust. His weathered face remained impassive as he surveyed the damage. "Same thing I told you I'd do yesterday and the day before that. You blocked my farm entrance I'm going through." Neighbors peered through blinds and stepped onto porches, drawn by the commotion. This confrontation had been brewing for months, ever since the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association had elected Patricia as president. The position had transformed the once reasonable dental hygienist into a rule enforcement machine, clipboard perpetually in hand violation notices her preferred form of communication. "This is a direct violation of HOA bylaw 16.3. Patricia's voice had reached that particular pitch that made dogs howl 3 blocks away. She fumbled for her phone. "I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," Hank replied calmly. "While you're at it, explain why you've been blocking access to my agricultural easement that's clearly documented in the county records and specifically exempted in those bylaws you're so fond of quoting." Patricia's face flushed crimson. She knew perfectly well about the easement. It was precisely why she parked her motorcycle there. Meadowbrook Estates had been built on what was once farmland, with Hank's family retaining the 50 acres behind the subdivision. The access road through the neighborhood was his legal right, but Patricia considered it an eyesore that lowered property values. "The board voted last night," she said, chin lifting. "We're challenging the easement. Until it's resolved, no farm equipment is permitted through Meadowbrook." "That's not how easements work, Patricia." The new voice belonged to Eleanor Chen, who stepped forward from her porch. As a real estate attorney, she warned the HOA board about this very situation. The board can't just vote away a legally binding easement. Other neighbors had begun to gather, their allegiances visibly split. Some stood behind Patricia, arms crossed and faces stern. Others positioned themselves closer at Hank, their expressions sympathetic. The division in Meadowbrook had been growing for months, with Patricia's increasingly aggressive enforcement creating 2 distinct camps. "This isn't just about an easement," Patricia snapped. "It's about the character of our community. Do you want to live somewhere where tractors and livestock trailers rumble past your homes? Where dirt and manure get tracked onto our streets? What I don't want," called out Dave Gonzalez from his driveway, "is to pay another special assessment to fund your legal crusades, Patricia. This is the 3rd one this year." Patricia's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the growing opposition. She hadn't expected this level of resistance, but she hadn't become HOA president by backing down. "Emergency board meeting. My house. 7 o'clock, she announced sharply, before turning on her heel and marching away, already composing violation notices in her head for everyone who had dared to question her authority. Behind her, Hank quietly began making calls to his insurance company, knowing this battle was far from over. Patricia's living room transformed into a war room by 7 o'clock. Ward members perched uncomfortably on her pristine white furniture, each provided with a coaster for their water glasses. No other beverages permitted on meeting nights. The gleaming hardwood floors reflected the recessed lighting, not a speck of dust visible anywhere in the meticulously staged home. "As I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted," Patricia continued, glaring at Gerald Wilson, the board treasurer who had dared to question the legality of challenging Hank's easement, "we have a responsibility to protect our property values. That's what people elected us to do. They elected us to maintain common areas and enforce reasonable rules," Gerald countered, adjusting his glasses, "not to wage expensive legal battles we can't win." Patricia's smile tightened. "I've already consulted with an attorney." "Not Eleanor Chen, I hope," interjected Diane Foster with a knowing look. As board secretary, she'd been documenting Patricia's increasingly erratic decisions with growing concern. "Of course not. Eleanor clearly has a conflict of interest," Patricia sniffed. "I've retained Blackwell and Associates. They specialize in property disputes and come highly recommended." What Patricia didn't mention was that Martin Blackwell was her brother-in-law, or that his retainer had already been paid from her personal funds, an investment she planned to recoup through the special assessment she would push through tonight. Outside, the evening had cooled and several residents had gathered at Eleanor Chen's house for an impromptu counter-meeting. Hank sat at her kitchen table, his calloused hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, explaining the situation to the dozen neighbors who had shown up in solidarity. "My family has owned this land since 1937, he said, spreading out yellow documents on the table. "When the developer bought the surrounding parcels in 2002, this easement was explicitly preserved. It's the only access point to my fields." "We know, Hank," Eleanor reassured him. "I've reviewed the documents. Your easement is ironclad." Dave Gonzalez leaned forward. So what's Patricia's endgame here? She can't possibly think she'll win this. Eleanor's expression grew troubled. I think this stopped being about the easement a long time ago. This is about control. Patricia needs to win, regardless of the cost, to her or to the community. Back at Patricia's house, the emergency board meeting had devolved into heated debate. 3 of the 7 board members openly opposed Patricia's plan to levy a special assessment for legal fees. 2 supported her unconditionally, leaving Gerald and Patricia's neighbor Kyle Morgan as the swing votes. I just don't see how we justify $1,000 per household for this, Kyle said hesitantly. He recently lost his job and couldn't afford another assessment. Patricia's eyes narrowed. Kyle, didn't you install that shed last summer? I don't recall seeing approved plans for that. The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Kyle's shoulders slumped. I suppose we could at least consult with the attorney, he muttered. Gerald watched the exchange with growing outrage. This is blackmail, Patricia. This is protecting our community, she countered smoothly. All in favor of the special assessment. 5 hands slowly raised. Patricia's smile was triumphant as she marked the vote in the minutes. Excellent. Now about those unapproved garden gnomes on Maple Street. By 9 o'clock, news of the assessment had spread through the neighborhood text chain. At Eleanor's house, the mood darkened considerably. $1,000? For a lawsuit we'll lose? One neighbor exclaimed. Hank stood up. This has gone far enough. I tried being reasonable. I'd offer to limit my access hours to power wash the road after heavy equipment passes through, but I won't be bullied off my land. Eleanor placed a hand on his arm. We need to call an emergency meeting of homeowners. The board serves at our pleasure, and I think it's time we reminded Patricia of that fact. As neighbors nodded in agreement across the subdivision, Patricia stood at her window, watching the last board members leave. She knew about the gathering at Eleanor's house. Nothing happened in Meadowbrook without her knowledge. Let them plot. She'd been preparing for this confrontation for months. From her desk drawer, she removed a thick folder labeled Violations, documented and pending. Inside were photographs, dates, measurements, ammunition against anyone who dared to challenge her authority. She built her power methodically, one citation at a time. Tomorrow would bring consequences for the opposition. Patricia smiled as she added Hank's crushed motorcycle to her evidence collection. This wasn't just about an easement anymore. This was war. Morning dew still clung to the manicured lawns of Meadowbrook Estates when residents began finding the notices. Bright yellow papers tucked under windshield wipers, taped to front doors, and in some cases prominently staked into flower beds with garden flags that themselves violated HOA regulations on unauthorized lawn decor. Dave Gonzalez stared at his citation in disbelief. Improper trash bin placement, visible from street, $150 fine. He glanced at his garbage cans tucked neatly against the side of his garage as they had been for the past 7 years. Across the street, the Rodriguez family received notices for unapproved landscape modifications, the butterfly garden they'd planted with their children last weekend. 3 doors down, retired schoolteacher Margaret Winters found herself cited for excessive wind chime noise pollution. By 9 a.m., Eleanor Chen's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with texts and calls. 17 households had received violation notices overnight, every single one belonging to someone who had attended the meeting at her house the previous evening. This is beyond petty, Eleanor muttered, scrolling through the mounting photographic evidence neighbors were sending her. She'd received her own citation for unauthorized gathering exceeding permissible home occupancy limits, a rule Eleanor knew for a fact didn't exist in the bylaws. At his farm, Hank discovered something more troubling than a citation. Overnight, someone had placed concrete parking stops across his easement access, effectively blocking any vehicle from entering or exiting his property. A laminated notice was zip-tied to one of the barriers. Access temporarily suspended pending legal review. By order of Meadowbrook HOA Board. Hank's weathered face darkened as he examined the heavy concrete blocks. Moving them would require equipment he couldn't access because it was stored in his barn on the other side of the blockade. He pulled out his phone and called Eleanor. This has gone beyond harassment, Eleanor said after surveying the concrete barriers. This is illegal restraint of access. I'm filing for an emergency injunction this morning. Patricia watched from her second-floor window as Eleanor and Hank took photos of the barricade, satisfaction curling her lips into a smile. Let them file whatever legal paperwork they wanted. The wheels of justice turned slowly, and in the meantime, she held all the power in Meadowbrook. Her phone chimed with a text from board member Sophia Williams. Emergency HOA meeting called for 7 p.m. at the clubhouse. Residents organizing a vote to dissolve the current board. Patricia's smile vanished. She anticipated resistance, but not so quickly, and certainly not a full revolt. She fired off rapid texts to her loyal supporters and called her brother-in-law. "Martin, they're moving against the board. I need you to find some legal reason why they can't hold this meeting without proper notice." She drummed her French manicured nails against the windowsill. "What do you mean you can't? You're my attorney. Find something." By mid-afternoon, the neighborhood hummed with tension. Printed flyers appeared in mailboxes announcing the emergency meeting. Patricia countered with an official HOA email claiming the meeting violated proper notification procedures and was therefore invalid. Residents began taking sides, with some tearing down flyers while others distributed more. At 6:30 p.m., cars began filling the clubhouse parking lot. Patricia arrived early with her core supporters, occupying the board table at the front of the room, a stack of documents arrayed before her like a fortress wall. "This meeting is unauthorized," she announced as Eleanor and Hank entered, followed by a stream of residents. "Any votes taken will be considered invalid and subject to legal challenge." Eleanor stepped forward, unfazed. "Actually, Patricia, I've reviewed our bylaws thoroughly. Article 5, Section 3 provides for emergency meetings with just 2 hours' notice in cases where board actions may cause immediate harm to the community or its members." She held up a printed copy. "Your concrete barricade qualifies as causing immediate harm to a member's legal right of access." The room fell silent as Patricia scanned the document, her expression hardening. She hadn't anticipated that Eleanor would know the bylaws better than she did, but Patricia had maintained control of Meadowbrook by giving up easily. "Very well," she said, straightening her posture. "As board president, I'll chair this meeting. First agenda item. I move to replace the current chair for this emergency session," called Gerald Wilson from the back of the room. Given the conflict of interest, a chorus of "second" echoed through the clubhouse. Dawn broke over Meadowbrook Estates with the grinding whine of heavy machinery. Residents stumbled from their beds, pulling aside curtains to witness a scene that momentarily defied comprehension. A massive excavator was tearing up the pavement at the entrance to Hank's easement, while Patricia stood nearby in a hard hat and reflective vest, directing the operation with animated gestures. "What the hell is going on?" Dave Gonzalez demanded, jogging across his lawn in pajama pants and an inside-out t-shirt. Patricia turned, clipboard in hand, face arranged in a mask of professional concern. "Emergency utility work, I'm afraid. We discovered a critical water line issue that requires immediate attention." "Water line? There's no water line under that access road," Dave said, eyes narrowing as he surveyed the scene. 3 workers in matching vests were taking direction from a thin man in an ill-fitting suit whom Dave had never seen before. The company logo on the excavator was partially covered with blue tape. "Actually, according to these municipal plans, there absolutely is," Patricia replied smoothly, holding up a document with official-looking stamps. "The HOA is liable for any infrastructure damage, so we're taking proactive measures." At 6 a.m., without notice, Dave pulled out his phone and began recording. "This looks like sabotage, not maintenance." Patricia's smile didn't waver. "I'll thank you to stay behind this safety perimeter, Dave. OSHA regulations, you understand." By 6:30, a crowd had gathered. Eleanor Chen arrived still in her running clothes, having sprinted from 3 blocks away when she received Dave's frantic text. She took one look at the torn-up pavement and the growing trench across Hank's access road and pulled out her phone. "I need to speak with Judge Ramirez immediately." "Yes, I know what time it is. This is regarding case number CV 2025-07889, the emergency injunction filed yesterday afternoon. Tell her it's escalated to active destruction of the easement in question." Patricia's confidence faltered momentarily when she overheard Eleanor's call. The emergency injunction had been filed faster than she anticipated, but it was too late to stop now. By the time any judge could intervene, the easement would be impassable for weeks, if not months. "Keep going," she instructed the crew foreman, her brother-in-law's college roommate who owed him a favor. "According to the work order, this needs to be a 6-foot trench all the way across." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. 2 police cruisers pulled up to the scene, followed closely by Hank's truck. He'd been alerted by neighbors and had raced back from his early morning feed store run to find his access road being systematically destroyed. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," Patricia called out, rushing toward the police with her clipboard extended. "We've got unauthorized individuals interfering with critical utility work." The older officer, Sergeant Rivera, surveyed the scene with practiced calm. "Ma'am, we received reports of unauthorized construction and possible destruction of property. This is authorized emergency utility maintenance," Patricia insisted, thrusting the paperwork forward. "Fully documented and approved by the HOA board." "That's a lie," Gerald Wilson called out, having arrived moments before. "The board never approved this, and last night's emergency meeting specifically ordered the removal of barriers to this easement, not the creation of new ones." Sergeant Rivera accepted the documents from Patricia, examining them carefully. "These permits look official, but..." He paused, squinting at the signatures. This authorization is dated for next month, Ms. Winters. Patricia's face went blank. That's clearly a typo. And the work order is for Meadowlark Estates on the other side of town, not Meadowbrook, the officer continued, his expression hardening. Construction crews, please shut down your equipment immediately. The workers, already uneasy about the growing crowd and police presence, didn't need to be told twice. The excavator fell silent as Eleanor approached with her phone extended. I have Judge Ramirez on the line. She's issued an immediate cease and desist for any action affecting the easement pending this afternoon's hearing. Patricia's carefully constructed facade cracked. You have no idea what you're doing, she hissed, color rising in her cheeks. This neighborhood needs protection from. The Meadowbrook Community Center had never been so crowded. Every folding chair was occupied with latecomers lining the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Judge Angela Ramirez, known throughout the county for her no-nonsense approach to property disputes, had agreed to hold the emergency hearing in the neighborhood facility rather than the courthouse downtown, recognizing the importance of community involvement in resolving the conflict. Patricia sat rigidly beside her brother-in-law, Martin Blackwell, who kept shooting nervous glances toward the exit. His law practice primarily handled routine real estate closings and simple wills. He was visibly out of his depth in this proceeding. That morning's police questioning had resulted in Patricia being released with a citation for filing false permits, a minor charge compared to what could have followed if Hank had pressed for destruction of property charges. All rise, called the court officer who had accompanied Judge Ramirez. The crowd shuffled to their feet as the judge entered, carrying her own files rather than having a clerk manage them. She settled at the folding table that had been designated as her bench, adjusting her reading glasses as she surveyed the packed room. Be seated, she instructed, waiting for the rustle of movement to subside. I understand this is an unusual venue, but I believe neighborhood disputes are best addressed where neighbors can witness the proceedings. This hearing concerns emergency injunctive relief regarding an agricultural easement at 47 Orchard Lane. Eleanor Chen approached the makeshift podium, presenting her documentation with practiced efficiency. Your Honor, the facts are straightforward. Mr. Miller's easement has been established for over 20 years, is clearly recorded in all relevant property documents, and has been subjected to increasingly aggressive interference by the HOA board president, culminating in this morning's attempt to physically destroy the access point. Judge Ramirez nodded, reviewing the photos Eleanor provided of the morning's excavation. And the HOA's position, Mr. Blackwell? Martin stood awkwardly, tugging at his collar. Your Honor, while recent events may seem overzealous, the HOA has legitimate concerns about the nature and frequency of agricultural traffic through a residential development. We believe the easement should be subject to reasonable restrictions, such as being eliminated entirely. Judge Ramirez asked, one eyebrow raised skeptically. Patricia couldn't contain herself any longer. Your Honor, if I may speak plainly. Ms. Winters, please allow your counsel to represent you, the judge admonished. He doesn't understand what's at stake here. Patricia's voice rose sharply. I've seen what happens when residential areas get mixed with commercial traffic. Property values plummet, quality of life deteriorates, and before you know it, you're living next to a strip mall. A murmur ran through the crowd. Judge Ramirez tapped her pen, silencing the room. Ms. Winters, your personal experiences, while valid, do not override legally established property rights. However, she turned to Hank. Mr. Miller, would you be amenable to reasonable accommodations regarding the timing and frequency of your easement use? Hank stood, his weathered hands clasped before him. Your Honor, I've offered compromises from the beginning. Limited hours, no heavy equipment on weekends, even paying for quarterly street cleaning on the access route. The HOA, or rather, Ms. Winters, rejected every offer without counterproposal. Judge Ramirez nodded thoughtfully, then addressed the room at large. Community governance works best when it balances individual rights with collective welfare. It appears that balance was lost here. She shuffled her papers decisively. My ruling is as follows. The agricultural easement at 47 Orchard Lane is valid and must remain unobstructed. However, I am ordering the establishment of a joint committee, 3 HOA members and Mr. Miller, to create reasonable guidelines for its use. She peered over her glasses at Patricia. Ms. Winters, in light of this morning's events, I'm also issuing a restraining order preventing you from taking any action regarding this easement without court approval. And I strongly suggest the HOA board consider whether your leadership continues to serve the community's best interests. With a tap of her gavel on the folding table, the hearing concluded. The crowd began to disperse, breaking into animated discussion groups. Patricia sat frozen, staring straight. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and a buzz of activity at the damaged easement. By 8 o'clock, over 30 residents had gathered, armed with shovels, rakes, and work gloves. Dave Gonzalez's brother-in-law had arrived with a small paving crew and materials, refusing any payment beyond coffee and the promise of invitation to the neighborhood's next barbecue. "Never seen a community turn out like this for a repair job," he remarked to Dave as they surveyed the growing crowd. "You sure this is just about fixing an access road?" Dave shook his head. "It stopped being about the road a while ago. This is about reclaiming our neighborhood." Hank moved through the volunteers, organizing teams with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing farmhands during harvest season. Eleanor had brought large thermoses of coffee and coordinated with other neighbors to ensure a steady supply of water bottles and snacks throughout the day. Gerald Wilson, who had taken on the interim role of board president after an emergency meeting the previous evening, addressed the gathering with a brief but heartfelt speech. "Folks, what happened here wasn't just an attack on Hank's property rights. It was a symptom of how we've let our community governance go astray. Today, we're not just fixing a road, we're starting to fix Meadowbrook." The work progressed steadily, with neighbors who had previously only exchanged perfunctory waves now working side by side, sharing stories and discovering common interests. Margaret Winters, despite her 72 years, supervised the refreshment station with military precision, ensuring every worker stayed hydrated and fed. Around mid-morning, a hush fell over the worksite as Patricia's silver Mercedes pulled up at the edge of the gathering. She remained in her car for several long moments, watching the community effort with an unreadable expression. "Think she's here to serve more violations?" someone muttered, not entirely joking. Eleanor approached the car, maintaining a respectful distance as Patricia finally emerged. Gone was the crisp business attire and clipboard. Today she wore jeans and a simple blouse, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. "I didn't come to cause trouble," Patricia said before Eleanor could speak. She gestured vaguely at the scene before them. "I wanted to see what was happening." Eleanor nodded. "We're making good progress. Should be finished by late afternoon." An awkward silence stretched between them until Patricia finally asked, "Is there something I could help with?" The question clearly cost her considerable pride, and Eleanor recognized the gesture for what it was, a tentative step toward reconciliation. "We could use another person on the water distribution team," she suggested. "Margaret's running it." Patricia nodded stiffly and made her way toward the refreshment station, where Margaret welcomed her with more warmth than most would have managed. Within half an hour, Patricia was distributing water bottles to sweaty volunteers, her interaction strained but gradually easing as the morning wore on. Near noon, Hank approached her as she restocked a cooler. "Wasn't sure we'd see you here today," he said, accepting a bottle of water from her outstretched hand. Patricia met his gaze directly. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Miller. My actions were," she faltered. "Completely off the rails?" Hank suggested, his tone mild despite the words. A flicker of irritation crossed Patricia's face before she acknowledged the accuracy with a reluctant nod. "Yes, they were inexcusable, regardless of my concerns." "Concerns aren't the problem," Hank said, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's how we handle them that matters. My grandfather always said good fences make good neighbors, but only if both sides agree where the fence should go." Patricia considered this. "I resigned from the board last night," she said finally, effective immediately. "Heard about that," Hank replied. "Also heard they asked you to stay on as an advisor for the bylaws committee. You planning to take them up on it?" Patricia's surprise was evident. "They want me involved? After everything?" "Nobody's denying you know the rules inside and out," Hank said with a shrug. "That knowledge is valuable, just needs better application." Before Patricia could respond, a commotion arose near the edge of the property. A county zoning official had arrived, clipboard in hand, looking distinctly uncomfortable as he approached Gerald Wilson. "We've received a complaint about unauthorized road work being conducted without proper permits," the official explained, checking his paperwork. "Filed early this morning by—" 3 weeks later, the atmosphere in Meadowbrook Estates had transformed almost beyond recognition. The once rigid HOA board, now led by Gerald Wilson with Eleanor Chen serving as legal advisor, had begun revising the community bylaws with an emphasis on reasonable guidance rather than punitive enforcement. Violation notices had been replaced with friendly reminder cards, used sparingly and always with an offer of assistance for residents who might need help meeting community standards. Patricia Winters had maintained a lower profile, but true to her word, she'd been attending the bylaws committee meetings, offering her extensive knowledge while learning to listen to opposing viewpoints. The process hadn't been without friction. Old habits died hard, and Patricia still occasionally slipped into her authoritarian tendencies during heated discussions. "That's absolutely unworkable," she declared during one particularly contentious meeting about lawn maintenance standards. "If we don't specify maximum grass height, we'll have properties looking like abandoned lots within months." Dave Gonzalez, who had joined the committee specifically to counterbalance Patricia's influence, leaned forward. "Patricia, not everyone has your landscaping budget or free time. Some folks work 2 jobs, have health issues, or are single parents." Patricia opened her mouth to argue, then paused, visibly forcing herself to consider his perspective. It was a small moment of growth that didn't go unnoticed by the others present. Perhaps, she said slowly, he could establish a neighborhood assistance program for those with legitimate hardships, volunteers helping with yard work rather than issuing fines. The suggestion was met with surprised approval, and Patricia couldn't entirely hide her satisfaction at having contributed something constructive rather than restrictive. Outside the meeting room, Meadowbrook was buzzing with preparations for Hank's Harvest Festival. What had started as a simple thank you gathering had evolved into a significant community event, with residents contributing ideas, decorations, and time. Children created handmade signs announcing the festival, while a committee of residents worked with Hank to ensure his farm was ready to receive visitors while respecting his agricultural operations. The morning of the festival arrived with perfect autumn weather, crisp air, golden sunshine, and trees beginning their colorful transformation. Hank had spent days preparing, clearing a large area near his barn for parking, setting up hay bales for seating, and harvesting the best of his late-season produce for display and sampling. Patricia arrived early, having volunteered to help with setup. She parked her Mercedes, newly repaired after the motorcycle incident, beside Hank's farmhouse and surveyed the scene with a critical eye, clipboard still her constant companion. The welcome table should be repositioned to create better traffic flow, she announced as Hank emerged from his barn. And the hay bale seating needs to be arranged in a semicircle rather than rows if we want to encourage conversation. Hank suppressed a smile. Good morning to you too, Patricia. She had the grace to look slightly abashed. Sorry, old habits. Good morning, Hank. Your farm looks lovely. And it did. The morning light illuminated the well-maintained fields, sturdy outbuildings, and the historic farmhouse that had been in Hank's family for generations. It was a working farm, not a showplace, but its care and functionality held its own kind of beauty, one Patricia was only now beginning to appreciate. Got something to show you, Hank said, gesturing for her to follow him to the repaired access road. There, freshly installed, stood a simple wooden sign reading Miller Farm Access, established 1937. Underneath, a smaller line had been added, restored by Meadowbrook Community 2025. Patricia ran her fingers over the carved lettering. It's beautiful craftsmanship. Dave Gonzalez made it, Hank said. Turns out he's quite the woodworker when he's not being cited for trash and placement.